In this edition of Doc TV Monster Horror Documentary Series, we'll be examining all things that go bump in the night. That's right, the spotlight will be firmly planted on the darkness of horror in all its forms, especially in film. Get ready to learn all about the horror of it all. Horror is a speculative fiction genre intended to frighten, scare, or disgust. Literary historian J.A. Cutton defined the horror story as a piece of fiction in prose of variable length, which shocks or even frightens the reader, or perhaps induces a feeling of repulsion or loathing. Horror intends to create an eerie and frightening atmosphere for the reader. Horror is often divided into the psychological horror and supernatural horror subgenres. Often the central menace of a work of horror fiction can be interpreted as a metaphor for more significant fears of a society. Prevalent elements include ghosts, demons, vampires, werewolves, ghouls, the devil, witches, monsters, extraterrestrials, dystopian and post-apocalyptic worlds, serial killers, cannibalism, psychopaths, cults, dark magic, Satanism, the macabre, gore, and torture. Horror history. The horror genre has ancient origins, with roots in folklore and religious traditions focusing on death, the afterlife, evil, the demonic, and the principle of the thing embodied in the person. These manifested in stories of beings such as demons, witches, vampires, werewolves, and ghosts. European horror fiction became established through ancient Greek and Roman works. Mary Shelley's famous 1818 novel about Frankenstein was greatly influenced by the story of Hippolytus, whom Asclepius revives from death. Euripides wrote plays based on the tale Hippolytus Kaloktomenos and Hippolytus. In Plutarch's The Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans in the account of Cimon, the author describes the spirit of a murderer, Damon, who was murdered in a bathhouse in Caromia. Pliny the Younger tells the tale of Athenodorus Canonites, who bought a haunted house in Athens. Athenodorus was cautious, since the place seemed inexpensive. While writing a book on philosophy, he was visited by a ghostly figure bound in chains. The figure disappeared in the courtyard. The following day, the magistrates dug in the yard and found an unmarked grave. Elements of the horror genre also occur in biblical texts, notably in the Book of Revelation. Much horror fiction derives from the cruelest personages of the 15th century. Dracula can be traced to the Prince of Wallachia, Vlad III, whose alleged war crimes were published in German pamphlets. A 1499 pamphlet was published by Marcus Arer, which is most notable for its woodcut imagery. The alleged serial killer sprees of Gilles de Rais have been seen as the inspiration for Bluebeard. The motif of the vampires is most notably derived from the real-life noblewoman and murderess Elizabeth Bathory, and helped usher in the emergence of horror fiction in the 18th century, such as through Laszlo Turok's 1729 book Tragica Historia. The 18th century saw the gradual development of Romanticism and the Gothic horror genre. It drew on the written and material heritage of the late Middle Ages, finding its form with Horace Walpole's seminal and controversial 1764 novel, The Castle of Otranto. The first edition was published disguised as an actual medieval romance from Italy, discovered and republished by a fictitious translator. Once revealed as modern, many found it anachronistic, reactionary, or simply in poor taste, but it proved immediately popular. Otranto inspired Vathek's 1786 by William Beckford, a Sicilian romance, The Mysteries of Udolpho, The Italian by Anne Radcliffe, and The Monk by Matthew Lewis. A significant amount of horror fiction of this era was written by women and marketed toward a female audience, a typical scenario of the novel being a resourceful female menaced in a gloomy castle. The Gothic tradition blossomed into the genre that modern readers today called horror literature in the 19th century. Influential works and characters that continue resonating in fiction and film today saw their genesis in the brothers Grimm's Hansel and Gretel, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, John Polidori's The Vampire, Charles Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer, Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Jane C. Loudon's The Mummy, or A Tale of the 22nd Century, Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Thomas Becket Prest's Varney the Vampire, the works of Edgar Allan Poe, the works of Sheridan Le Fanu, Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Each of these works created an enduring icon of horror seen in later reimaginings on the page, stage, and screen. A proliferation of cheap periodicals around the turn of the century led to a boom in horror writing. For example, Gaston Leroux serialized his The Phantom of the Opera before it became a novel in 1910. One writer specializing in horror fiction for mainstream pulps, such as All Story magazine, was Todd Robbins, whose fiction deals with themes of madness and cruelty. In Russia, the writer Alexander Believ popularized these themes in his 1925 story Professor Dowell's Head, in which a mad doctor performs experimental head transplants and reanimations on bodies stolen from the morgue, and which was first published as a magazine serial before being turned into a novel. Later, specialist publications emerged to give horror writers an outlet. Weird Tales and Unknown Worlds were prominent among them. Influential horror writers of the early 20th century made inroads in these mediums, notably the venerated horror author H.P. Lovecraft and his enduring Cthulhu mythos transformed and popularized the genre of cosmic horror, and M.R. James is credited with redefining the ghost story in that era. The serial murderer became a recurring theme. Yellow journalism and sensationalism of various murderers, such as Jack the Ripper, and lesser so, Karl Panzram, Fritz Harman, and Albert Fish, all perpetuated this phenomenon. The trend continued in the post-war era, partly renewed after the murders committed by Ed Gein. In 1959, Robert Bloch, inspired by the murders, wrote Psycho. The crimes committed in 1969 by the Manson family influenced the slasher theme in horror fiction of the 1970s. Thomas Harris wrote Red Dragon in 1981, introducing Dr. Hannibal Lecter. The sequel to that novel, The Silence of the Lambs, was published in 1988. Early cinema was inspired by many aspects of horror literature and started a strong tradition of horror films and subgenres that continues to this day. Up until the graphic depictions of violence and gore on the screen commonly associated with the 1960s and the 1970s slasher films and splatter films, comic books, such as those published by EC Comics, most notably Tales from the Crypt in the 1950s, satisfied readers' quests for horror imagery that the silver screen could not provide. This imagery made these comics controversial. Consequently, they were frequently censored. The modern zombie tale dealing with the motif of the living dead harks back to works, including H.P. Lovecraft's stories Cool Air, In the Vault, and The Outsider, and Dennis Wheatley's Strange Conflict. Richard Matheson's 1954 novel I Am Legend influenced an entire genre of apocalyptic zombie fiction emblematized by the films of George A. Romero. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the enormous commercial success of three books, Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin, The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, and The Other by Thomas Tryon, encouraged publishers to begin releasing numerous other horror novels, thus creating a horror boom. One of the best-known late 20th century horror writers is Stephen King, known for Carrie, The Shining, It, Misery, and several dozen other novels, and about 200 short stories. Beginning in the 1970s, King's stories have attracted a large audience, for which the U.S. National Book Foundation awarded him in 2003. Other famous horror authors of the period included Anne Rice, Brian Lumley, Graham Masterton, James Herbert, Dean Koontz, Clive Barker, Ramsey Campbell, and Peter Straub. Best-selling book series of contemporary times exist in genres related to horror fiction, such as the werewolf fiction urban fantasy Kitty novel books by Carrie Vaughan 2005 onward. Horror elements continue to expand outside the genre. The alternate history of more traditional historical horror in Dan Simmons's 2007 novel The Terror sits on bookstore shelves next to genre mashups such as Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, and historical fantasy and horror comics such as Hellblazer Onward and Mike Mignola's Hellboy Onward. Horror also serves as one of the central genres in more complex modern works, such as Mark Z. Danilewski's House of Leaves, a finalist for the National Book Award. Many teen horror novels, such as The Monstrumologist by Rick Yancey. Additionally, many movies, particularly animated ones, use a horror aesthetic. These can be collectively referred to as children's horror. Although it's unknown for sure why children enjoy these movies, as it seems counterintuitive, it is theorized that it is the grotesque monsters that fascinate kids. Tangential to this, the internalized impact of horror television programs and films on children is relatively under-researched, especially when compared to the research done on the similar subject of violence on TV and film's impact on the young mind. What little research there is tends to be inconclusive on the effects of viewing such media. One defining trait of the horror genre is that it provokes an emotional, psychological, or physical response within readers that causes them to react with fear. One of H.P. Lovecraft's most famous quotes about the genre is, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." Science fiction historian Darrell Schweitzer has stated, in the simplest sense, a horror story is one that scares us, and the true horror story requires a sense of evil, not necessarily in a theological sense, but the menaces must be truly menacing, life-destroying, and antithetical to happiness. In her essay Elements of Aversion, Elizabeth Barrett articulates the need by some for horror tales in a modern world. The old fight or flight reaction of our evolutionary heritage once played a major role in the life of every human. Our ancestors lived and died by it. Then someone invented the fascinating game of civilization, and things began to calm down. Development pushed wilderness back from settled lands. War, crime, and other forms of social violence came with civilization, and humans started preying on each other. But by and large, daily life calmed down. We began to feel restless, to feel something missing. The excitement of living on the edge, the tension between hunter and hunted. So we told each other stories through the long, dark nights. When the fires burned low, we did our best to scare the daylights out of each other. The rush of adrenaline feels good. Our hearts pound, our breath quickens, and we can imagine ourselves on edge. Yet we also appreciate the insightful aspects of horror. Sometimes a story tends to shock and disgust, but the best horror intends to rattle our cages and shake us out of our complacency. It makes us think, forces us to confront ideas we might rather ignore, and challenges preconceptions of all kinds. Horror reminds us that the world is not always as safe as it seems, which exercises our mental muscles and reminds us to keep a little healthy caution close at hand. In a sense, similar to why a person seeks out the controlled thrill of a roller coaster, readers in the modern era seek out horror and terror to feel a sense of excitement. However, Barrett adds that horror fiction is one of the few mediums where readers seek out a form of art that forces them to confront ideas and images they might rather ignore, to challenge preconceptions of all kinds. One can see the confrontation of ideas that readers and characters would rather ignore throughout literature in famous moments such as Hamlet's musings about the skull of Yorick, its implications of the mortality of humanity, and the gruesome end bodies inevitably come to. In horror fiction, the confrontation with the gruesome is often a metaphor for the problems facing the current generation of the author. There are many theories as to why people enjoy being scared. For example, people who like horror films are more likely to score highly for openness to experience, a personality trait linked to intellect and imagination. It is a now commonly accepted view that the horror elements of Dracula's portrayal of vampirism are metaphors for sexuality in a repressed Victorian era. But this is merely one of many interpretations of the metaphor of Dracula. Jack Halberstam postulates many of these in his essay Technologies of Monstrosity. Bram Stoker's Dracula. He writes, "The image of dusty and unused gold, coins from many nations, and old unworn jewels immediately connects Dracula to the old money of a corrupt class, a kind of piracy of countries, and the aristocracy's worst excesses." Halberstam articulates a view of Dracula as manifesting the growing perception of the aristocracy as an evil and outdated notion to be defeated. The depiction of a multinational band of protagonists using the latest technologies such as a telegraph to share quickly, collate, and act upon new information is what leads to the destruction of the vampire. This is one of many interpretations of the metaphor of only one central figure of the canon of horror fiction, as over a dozen possible metaphors are referenced in the analysis, from the religious to the anti-Semitic. Noel Carroll's philosophy of horror postulates that a modern piece of horror fiction's monster, villain, or a more inclusive menace must exhibit the following two traits: a threatening menace, physically, psychologically, socially, morally, spiritually, or some combination of those; a menace that is impure, that violates the generally accepted schemes of cultural categorization. We consider impure that which is categorically contradictory. In addition to those essays and articles shown above, scholarship on horror fiction is almost as old as horror fiction itself. In 1826, the Gothic novelist Anne Radcliffe published an essay distinguishing two elements of horror fiction: terror and horror. Whereas terror is a feeling of dread before an event happens, horror is a feeling of revulsion or disgust after an event. Radcliffe describes terror as expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life, whereas horror is defined as that which freezes and nearly annihilates them. Modern scholarship on horror fiction draws upon a range of sources. Devendra Varma and S.L. Varnado refers to the theologian Rudolf Otto in their historical studies of the Gothic novel. The concept of the numinous of the latter was initially used to describe religious experience. Numerous awards recognize achievements in horror fiction. The Horror Writers Association presents the Bram Stoker Awards for Superior Achievement, named in honor of Bram Stoker, author of the seminal horror novel Dracula. The Australian Horror Writers Association presents the annual Australian Shadows Awards. The International Horror Guild Award was presented annually to horror and dark fantasy works from 1995 to 2008. The Shirley Jackson Awards are literary awards for outstanding achievement in the literature of psychological suspense, horror, and fantastic dark works. Other important awards for horror literature are included as subcategories within general awards for fantasy and science fiction in such awards as the Orioles Award. Some fiction writers, generally classified as horror, tend to dislike the term, considering it too lurid. They instead use the words dark fantasy or gothic fantasy for supernatural horror, or psychological thriller for non-supernatural horror. Now that we understand the genre's roots, let's turn our eyes toward the silver screen and dissect the history of horror movies. Beliefs in the supernatural, devils, and ghosts have existed in folklore and religions of many cultures for centuries. These would become integral parts of the horror genre. Zombies, for example, originated from Haitian folklore. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, writers would develop more key horror texts than any other period preceding it. While they were not all straight horror stories, their horrific elements lingered in popular culture, with their set pieces becoming staples in horror cinema. Critic and author Kim Newman described Georges Méliès' Le Manoir du Diable as the first horror film, featuring elements that would become staples in the genre: images of demons, ghosts, and haunted castles. The early 20th century cinema production was hectic. Several adaptations of stories were made within months of each other. This included Poe adaptations made in France and the United States to Frankenstein adaptations being made in the United States and Italy. The most adapted of these stories was The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which had 3 versions made in 1920 alone. Early German cinema involved Poe-like stories, such as The Student of Prague, which featured director and actor Paul Wegener. Wegener would work in similar features, such as The Golem and The Dancing Girl and its related Golem films. Other era actors featured in similar films included Werner Krause and Conrad Veidt, who starred in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, leading to similar roles in other German productions. In 1922, F.W. Murnau would also direct an adaptation of Nosferatu, a film Newman described as standing as the only screen adaptation of Dracula to be primarily interested in horror from the character's rat-like features and thin body. The film was, even more so than Caligari, a template for the horror film. Following the 1927 success of the Broadway play Dracula, Universal Studios officially purchased the rights to both the play and the novel. After the Dracula's premiere on February 12, 1931, the film received what authors of the book, Universal Horrors, proclaimed as uniformly positive, some even laudatory reviews. The commercial reception surprised Universal, who forged ahead to make a similar production of 1931's Frankenstein. Frankenstein also proved to be a hit for Universal, leading to both Dracula and Frankenstein making film stars of their leads, Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. Karloff starred in Universal's follow-up The Mummy, which Newman described as the studio knowing what they were getting, patterning the film close to the plot of Dracula. Lugosi and Karloff would star together in several Poe adaptations in the 1930s. Following the release of Dracula, the Washington Post declared the film's box office success led to a cycle of similar films. At the same time, the New York Times stated in a 1936 overview that Dracula and the arrival of sound film began the real triumph of these spectral thrillers. Other studios began developing their horror projects, with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Paramount Pictures, and Warner Bros. Universal would also follow up with several horror films until the mid-1930s. After the success of Son of Frankenstein, Universal's horror films received what author Rick Werland of the horror film called a second wind. Horror films continued to be produced quickly into the mid-1940s. Universal looked into their 1930s horror properties to develop new follow-ups, such as The Invisible Man and The Mummy series. Universal saw potential in making actor Lon Chaney Jr. A new star to replace Karloff, as Chaney had not distinguished himself in either or all B pictures. Chaney Jr. would become a horror star for the decade, showing in the films in the Wolfman series, portraying several of Universal's monster characters. B-Picture Studios also developed films that imitated the style of Universal's horror output. Karloff worked with Columbia Pictures, acting in various films as a mad doctor-type character, starting with The Man They Could Not Hang. In contrast, Lugosi worked between Universal and Poverty Row Studios, such as Producers Releasing Corporation for The Devil Bat and Monogram for 9 feature films. In March 1942, producer Val Lewton ended his working relationship with independent producer David O. Selznick to work for RKO Radio Pictures' Charles Comer, becoming the head of a new unit created to develop B-movie horror feature films. According to screenwriter DeWitt Bowden and director Jack Tourneur, Lewton's first horror production, Cat People, Lewton wanted to make something different from the Universal horror, with Tourneur describing it as making something intelligent and in good taste. Lewton developed a series of horror films for RKO, described by Newman as polished, doom-haunted, poetic. Several horror films of the 1940s, borrowed from Cat People, specifically feature a female character who fears that she has inherited the tendency to turn into a monster or attempt to replicate the shadowy visual style of the film. Hollywood made almost no new horror films between 1947 and 1951. This was due to sharply declining sales, leading both major and poverty row studios to re-release their older horror films during this period rather than make new ones. The early 1950s featured only a few Gothic horror films developed before the release of Hammer Film Productions' Gothic films. Hammer began developing American-styled science fiction films in the early 1950s, but later branched into horror with their color films The Curse of Frankenstein and Dracula. These films would birth two horror film stars, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, leading to further horror film production from Hammer in the decade. Among the most influential horror films of the 1950s was The Thing from Another World, with Newman stating that countless science fiction horror films would follow in its style. For 5 years following the release of The Thing from Another World, nearly every film involving aliens, dinosaurs, or radioactive mutants would be dealt with matter-of-fact characters as seen in the movie. Films featuring vampires, werewolves, and Frankenstein's monster also took to having science fiction elements of the era, such as having characters have similar plot elements to Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Horror films also expanded into international productions in the latter half of the 1950s, with films in the genre being made in Mexico, Italy, Germany, and France. The horror film changed dramatically in 1960, specifically with Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho based on the novel by Robert Bloch. Newman declared that the film elevated the idea of a multiple personality serial killer, setting the tone for future films that were only touched upon in earlier melodramas and film noirs. The release of Psycho led to similar pictures about the psychosis of characters and a brief reappearance of what Newman described as stately, tasteful horror films, such as Jack Clayton's The Innocents and Robert Wise's A Haunting. Newman described Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby as the other event horror film of the 1960s after Psycho. Roger Corman worked with AIP to make House of Usher, which led to several future Poe adaptations and other 60s Poe adaptations by Corman. He provided roles for aging horror stars such as Karloff and Chaney Jr. These films were made to compete with the British colour horror films from Hammer in the United Kingdom, featuring their horror stars Cushing and Fisher, whose Frankenstein series continued from 1958 to 1973. Competition for Hammer appeared in the mid-1960s in the United Kingdom with Amicus Productions. The latter also made a feature film featuring Cushing and Lee. Like Psycho, Amicus drew from contemporary sources such as Bloch, leading to Hammer adapting works by more authors from the era. Mario Bava's 1960 film, Black Sunday, marked an increase in on-screen violence in cinema. Earlier British horror films had their gorier scenes cut on the initial release or suggested through narration, while Psycho suggested its violence through fast editing. Black Sunday, by contrast, depicted violence without suggestion. This level of violence would later be seen in other works of Bava and other Italian films, such as The Giallo of Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci. Other independent American productions of the 1960s expanded on the gore shown in the films in a genre later described as the splatter film, with films by Herschel Gordon Lewis such as Blood Feast. At the same time, Newman found that the true breakthrough of these independent films was George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which set new attitudes for the horror film, one that was suspicious of authority figures, broke taboos of society, and was satirical between its more suspenseful set pieces. Historian John Kenneth Muir described the 1970s as a truly eclectic time for horror cinema, noting a mixture of new and more personal efforts on film. In contrast, others were a resurrection of older characters that had appeared in the 1930s and 40s. Night of the Living Dead had what Newman described as a slow-burning influence on horror films of the era, and what he described as the first of the genre auteurs who worked outside studio settings. These included American directors such as John Carpenter, Tobe Hooper, Wes Craven, and Brian De Palma, and directors working outside America such as Bob Clark, David Cronenberg, and Dario Argento. Before Night of the Living Dead, The monsters of horror films could quickly be banished or defeated by the end of the film. In contrast, Romero's film and other filmmakers' films would often suggest other horrors still lingered after the credits. Both Amicus and Hammer ceased feature film production in the 1970s. Remakes were popular for horror films in the 1970s, with films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Tales based on Dracula, which continued into the late 70s with John Badham's Dracula and Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire. Although not an official remake, the last high-grossing horror film of the decade, Alien, took B-movie elements from movies like it. The Terror from Beyond Space. Newman has suggested high-grossing films like Alien, Jaws, and Halloween became hits by being relentless suspense machines with high visual sophistication. He continued that Jaws' memorable music theme and its monster not being a product of society like Norman Bates in Psycho had carried over into Halloween's Michael Myers and its film's theme music. With the appearance of home video in the 1980s, horror films were subject to censorship in the United Kingdom in a phenomenon popularly known as video nasties, leading to video collections being seized by police and some people being jailed for selling or owning some horror films. Newman described the response to the video nasty issue that led to horror films becoming dumber than the previous decade. Although films were not less gory, they were more lightweight, becoming more disposable, less personal works. Newman noted that these directors who created original material in the 70s, such as Carpenter, David Cronenberg, and Tobe Hooper, would at least briefly play it safe with Stephen King adaptations or remakes of the 1950s horror material. Replacing Frankenstein's monster and Dracula were new popular characters with more general names like Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, and Freddy Krueger. Unlike the characters of the past, who were vampires or created by mad scientists, these characters were seemingly people with common-sounding names who developed the slasher film genre of the era. The genre was derided by several contemporary film critics of the period, such as Roger Ebert, and often was highly profitable at the box office. The 1980s highlighted several films about body transformation through special effects and makeup artists like Rob Bottin and Rick Baker. They allowed for more detailed and graphic transformation scenes of the human body in various forms of horrific transformation. Traditional styles continued into the 80s, such as supernatural-themed films involving haunted houses, ghosts, and demonic possession. Among the most popular films of the style included Stanley Kubrick's The Shining and Hooper's high-grossing Poltergeist. After the release of movies based on Stephen King's books, like The Shining and Carrie, led to further film adaptations of his novels throughout the 1980s. Horror films of the 1990s also failed to develop as many significant new directors of the genre as they had in the 60s or 70s. Young independent filmmakers such as Kevin Smith, Richard Linklater, Michael Moore, and Quentin Tarantino broke into cinema outside the genre at non-genre festivals like the Sundance Film Festival. Newman noted that the early 90s was not a good time for horror, noting the excessive release of sequels. Muir commented that in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, the United States did not have a serious enemy internationally, leading to horror films adapting to fictional enemies predominantly within America, with the American government, large businesses, organized religion, and the upper class, as well as supernatural and occult items such as vampires or Satanists, filling in the horror villains of the 90s. The rapid growth of technology in the 1990s with the internet and the fears of the year 2000 problems causing the end of the world were reflected in plots of films. Other genre-based trends of the 1990s included the postmodern horror films, such as Scream, were made in this era. Postmodern horror films continued into the 2000s, eventually just being released as humorous parody films. By the end of the 90s, 3 films were released that Newman described as cultural phenomenons. These included Hideo Nakota's Ring, a significant hit across Asia, The Sixth Sense, another ghost story that Newman described as making an instant cliché of twist endings, and the low-budget independent film The Blair Witch Project. Newman described the first trend of horror films in the 2000s followed the success of The Blair Witch Project, but predominantly parodies or similar low-budget imitations. Teen-oriented series began in the era with Final Destination. At the same time, the success of the 1999 remake of William Castle's House on Haunted Hill led to a series of remakes in the decade. The popularity of the Dawn of the Dead remake led to a revival in American zombie films in the late 2000s. Beyond remakes, other long-dormant horror franchises, such as The Exorcist and Friday the 13th, received new feature films. After Ring's success, several films from Hong Kong, South Korea, Thailand, and Japan with similar detective plotlines investigating ghosts. This trend was echoed in the West with films with similar plots and Hollywood remakes of Asian movies like The Ring. In the United Kingdom, there was what Newman described as a modest revival of British horror films, first with war-related horror films, and several independent films of various styles, with Newman describing the breakouts of the new British horror, including 28 Days Later and Shaun of the Dead. David Edelstein of the New York Times coined a term for a genre he described as torture porn in a 2006 articles as a label for films described, often retroactively, to over 40 films since 2003. Edelstein lumped in films such as Saw and Wolf Creek under this banner, suggesting the audience as titillating and shocking. In contrast, film scholars of early 21st century horror films described them as intense bodily acts and visible bodily representations to produce uneasy reactions. Kevin Wetmore, using the Saw film series, suggested these films reflected a post-9/11 attitude towards increasing pessimism, precisely one of no redemption, no hope, no expectations that we're going to be okay. After the film studio, Blumhouse had success with Paranormal Activity. The studio continued producing films that became hits in the 2010s with the film series Insidious. This led to what Newman described as the company's policy on commercial savvy with thematic risk that has often paid off, such as Get Out and series like The Purge. In her article for Vanity Fair, Laura Bradley noted that both large and small film studios began noticing Blumhouse's success, including A24, which became popular with films like The Witch and Midsommar. Bradley commented how some of these films have been classified as elevated horror, a term used for works that were elevated beyond traditional or pure genre films, but declared horror aficionados and some critics pushed back against the notion that these films are doing something entirely new, noting their roots in films like 1968's Night of the Living Dead and Rosemary's Baby. The increased use of streaming services in the 2010s has also been suggested as boosting the popularity of horror, as well as Netflix and Amazon Prime Video producing and distributing numerous works in the genre. Shudder launched in 2015 as a horror-specific service. In the early 2010s, a wave of horror films began exhibiting what Virginie Salovey described as a psychedelic tendency. This was inspired by experimentation and subgenres of the 1970s, specifically folk horror. The trend started with Enter the Void and Beyond the Black Rainbow, and continued throughout the decade with films like Climax. Adapted from the Stephen King novel 2017, it set a box office record for horror films. The success of it led to further King novels being adapted into new feature films. The beginning of 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact on the film industry, leading to several horror films being held back from release or having their production halted. During lockdowns, streaming for movies featuring fictional apocalypses increased, undoubtedly a reflection of these extraordinary times. Horror will continue to intrigue and fascinate the public at large. People continue to seek out the darker parts of our world with glee and curiosity, and who could blame them? Sometimes those things can be lots of fun. Join us for another episode of Doc TV Monster Horror documentary series soon.